Chapter 6. The Orthogenic school. Gail Schulenberger was 22 years old when she arrived in Chicago, not long off the farm in South Dakota. Like many career-minded young women in the 1940s, she thought vaguely that she might like to be a social worker. But although she had taken some college courses, she had no degree, and attending classes now was out of the question, because she was broke. Desperate for a job, she applied for typing work at a home she had heard worked with children, a place called the Orthogenic School at the University of Chicago. When an interviewer asked if she had any teaching experience, she said she had been a high school substitute on a couple of occasions back in South Dakota. Substitute night nurse. Schulenberger slept at this nutty place every night for the next 2 weeks. Charged mainly with looking after a teenage boy who wandered the halls and scrubbed his hands so often that they were red and coarse. He also refused to take food from anybody's hands, so she was told to leave it for him, as if for a terrified puppy. My job really was to stay up until he was in bed, sometimes 1 or 2 in the morning, Schulenberger told me. The night nurse whose place I took was an old prune, a wicked woman, I thought. She complained that the boy had a full set of keys to the school's locks, but that the principal would not let anyone take them away from him. I didn't know much about mental illness, but I thought, good for him. At one of her first staff meetings, Schulenberger learned that this principal was a Viennese immigrant with the resonant name of Bruno Bettelheim, that he had just taken over the school, and that he knew everything that was wrong with it and what changes had to be made. I walked out on air. It was the most exciting day of my life. This exhilaration soon spread as Bettelheim and purging much of the staff assembled by his predecessor, Mandel Sherman, and hiring his own people, almost all young women like Schulenberger with little or no experience. When Veronica Dryevich, who had been one of Bettelheim's devoted students at Rockford College, wrote in seeking a scholarship reference to continue her education, he called her and convinced the 20-year-old she should come work at the school. 2 other Rockford disciples, Marjorie Jewell and Betty Lupingre, were also among the recruits in those first weeks. The whole idea of working at the school seemed interesting, Pingree told me. But I didn't know a thing about emotionally disturbed children. I think he hired us because he didn't want a staff with its own ideas, people who had been trained by someone else. On her first day, Pingree and another counselor took a few pre-adolescent boys out to play football on the Midway, the grass expanse across the street from the school. Pingree recalled ruefully that she acted less like someone dealing with delinquent and unpredictable children than like a Girl Scout leader eager to join in the fun. With the result that the boys soon swirled out of control, turning on both women and ripping Pingree's blouse. In tears, the neophytes somehow managed to round up their charges and get them back to the school, where Bettelheim waited. He delivered the boys into the care of another counselor and took the 2 young women around the corner to his apartment, where he and Trude served them tea. Bettelheim told them they had gone wrong by acting too much like the children, and that this had frightened the boys, who needed a refuge from the moment he took over the converted church property at the corner of 60th Street and Dorchester Avenue. But he knew he could not do it with the kind of population they had. Inherited from Sherman, a mix of about 3 dozen patients, many well into their teens, that included children suffering from epilepsy, encephalitis, hydrocephalus, and other physiological maladies. Superscript 1. Bettelheim told the parents or social agencies responsible for placing these children in the school that they must be withdrawn as soon as possible. From now on, newly admitted patients would range in age from about 6 to 14, must be of normal or greater intelligence, and must be free of physical disorder, but suffer from severe emotional disturbances that have proved or are expected to prove beyond the reach of the common therapeutic techniques. Squared under Sherman. The average stay at the school had been just short of 11 months. Cubed Bettelheim felt that to make any significant progress a child needed to remain in his care for at least 2 years. Bruno said our job was to give the children a childhood. Recalled Josette Wingo, who arrived at the school at age 23, a gunnery instructor just out of the Navy. Overnight, she and the other novices became instant mothers, most of them living at the school. In the morning, they coaxed the children out of their dorm beds, down to breakfast, and off to the school's classrooms. In the afternoons, they took the children on outings in the neighborhood, to the Museum of Science and Industry, or on shopping expeditions beneath the L tracks on 63rd Street, or to the 57th Street beach for a swim. For the long, summer twilight hours, they encouraged intense games of tag or kick the can on the midway. Sessions Schulenberger called take 'em out and run 'em till they drop. These workouts were supposed to leave the children so played out that, after a bath and a soporific chapter of Swiss Family Robinson, they would readily nod off, a theory tested nightly by children who saw myriad demons in the dark. While the counselors comforted them, sometimes for an hour or more, impatient boyfriends and future husbands sat in the living room downstairs, leafing through a stack of dog-eared New Yorkers and exchanging wary glares with Bettelheim as he passed by the doorway. The counselors coped with lost teddy bears, overflowing bathtubs and toilets, and misbuttoned pajamas. Flickering range of behavior manifested by the more children sat mute for hours, soiled themselves nightly, exploded with rage seemingly without provocation, vomited at mealtime for no apparent reason, smeared food in their hair and feces on their clothes, gorged themselves or refused to eat, ran away and rode the L to the end of the line, lashed out with fists or kicks, and sometimes threatened to kill themselves, another child, or a counselor. One evening, Schulenberger took the boys in her dorm down to the kitchen for a snack. Harry, perhaps the most violent child at the school in the late 1940s, clambered up onto a counter, grabbed a carving knife from its hook, and threw it at the counselor, narrowly missing her head. Such incidents were not common, but the mere possibility of them, combined with the routine pressure of caring for the children, left the young women physically and emotionally exhausted at the end of the day, and nagged by a fear that they were out of their depth working at this last chance ranch, as Schulenberger came to call the school. Yet, at the same time, recalled Joan Little, who had come to the University of Chicago from Kansas and had just crossed into her 20s when she gravitated toward the school. We had a feeling of doing pioneering work, of being connected with ideas and movements from Europe. New notions of how to treat emotionally disturbed and delinquent children had crossed the Atlantic throughout the 1930s. Not least those put forth by August Ayatern in Wayward Youth, which had come out in an English translation in 1935. Others who contributed to this ferment in child therapy included Jean Piaget, Maria Montessori, Anna Freud, Melanie Klein, and Etta the Sterba, as well as Bruno Bettelheim's psychology professor and dissertation reader Karl Buhler and his wife, Charlotte. One result of these fresh ideas was that institutions that for years had been primarily custodial began cautiously moving toward treating their patients. By 1930, the American psychiatrist Harry Stack Sullivan was attempting to show that schizophrenics could be understood, no matter how difficult their behavior. The Menninger Clinic's Southard School in Topeka, which had been housing retarded and brain-damaged children, started taking those with emotional troubles instead. Other institutions followed the same path, among them the Rither Child Center in Seattle, Hawthorne Cedar Knolls near New York City, and Bella Fair in Cleveland. World War II put this residential treatment movement on hold, but tremendous energy poured into all areas of children like those now entering the Orthogenic school. Bettelheim's approach was mainly psychoanalytic. He often riveted the counselors with his photographic knowledge of the Freudian canon when they gathered in the basement kitchen after the children finally went to sleep. It was the most exciting thing I had ever done in my life, recalled Jean O'Leary, who was 19 when she became a counselor soon after Bettelheim took over. She was thrilled to be part of the university community and living at the school instead of in the stifling family atmosphere of her South Side home, where she had slept in the living room. Bettelheim gave me religion, which I laugh at now, because psychoanalysis doesn't play a big part in my life any longer. But at the time it gave me a system, a way to judge things. At the informal kitchen gatherings, the staff began calling the director drive. B, the Truncati Pingri, Dryavijam Jewel had brought from Rockford, and that Bettelheim readily accepted. The counselors brought him their questions and anxieties about the children's behavior, and their personal woes inevitably spilled out as well. Whenever anybody was in trouble, recalled Josette Wingo, it turned out that Bruno had a friend back in Vienna who had the same kind of problem. Someone would be about to kill himself over a broken love affair, and he would tell us of a friend who had decided not to kill himself at the last minute. Only later did we realize that these were Bruno's scenarios, his teaching stories, and that nobody had that many friends go through so many crises. Bettelheim sometimes embroidered his refugee experience as well. At one session, he said that in the 1930s he had made anti-Nazi speeches not only in Austria but in Germany itself, and that, at the Anschluss, he was on a plane with the motors running when Hitler Youth kept it from taking off, leading to his arrest and incarceration in the camps. O'Leary recalled that when they asked him how he had escaped from Buchenwald, he replied that nobody escaped, but did not answer the question. Over coffee, tea, and cake, he combined such grandiosity and evasions with wistful descriptions of Vienna, only recently the target of Allied bombers. As the counselors sat, like children at story time themselves, Drive B told of seeing the Emperor Franz Joseph's funeral procession in 1916, of walking in the Vienna woods and the Prater, of the art revolution wrought by Klimt and Schiele and the other secessionists, of sitting for hours in the coffee houses along the Ringstrasse, of a time that seemed to swim in culture. Sylvester also awed the counselors, and he had hired this capable Viennese doctor, who he said had helped him write the report for Ralph Tyler that got him his job as the school's psychiatrist. And when she arrived for her weekly visits, he greeted her as if she were royalty, scurrying down the steps to meet her and ushering her into the living room, where he served her coffee. In her mid-30s, she was 7 years his junior, but far better educated and more experienced in the treatment of troubled children. She held a psychology doctorate and medical degree from Vienna, and had interned at the Children's Hospital there. She was an associate in the Department of Neuropsychiatry at Chicago's Michael Reese Hospital, and she also had trained at the Psychoanalytic Institutes in both Vienna and Chicago. By the time Bettelheim took over the school, Sylvester was already a life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. She seemed always in command, a robust, energetic woman with a determined stride, whose sculptured features beneath a swirl of dark curls gave her a dramatic countenance. Her legs drew surreptitious wolf whistles from the few men on the staff, and her stylish clothes made the female counselors feel all the more dowdy in their faded jeans and rumpled blouses and skirts. Each week, Sylvester saw 1 or 2 children in private, and then met with Bettelheim and the counselors to discuss what she had learned. The youthful staff sat wide-eyed as the 2 Viennese accents parsed the wounded psyches of the children with what seemed like laser insights. Both therapists sometimes expressed frustration that they could not find the English words and phrases to characterize a child's behavior. After struggling together to describe one depressed boy, they finally laughed, threw up their hands, and decided that he looked like a canary that had fallen into a bowl of soup. But their relationship was not always so collegial. Sylvester held more orthodox psychoanalytic views than Bettelheim and was not bashful about stressing them, or about noting, when they disagreed in staff meetings, that she was better trained than he was. Superscript 1. Few American women stood up to men in public in this way, and the counselors drew strength from Sylvester's self-confidence. Whenever they felt discouraged, she buoyed them up, assuring them that even the smallest act, buying a boy a new pair of corduroys, helping a girl make fudge, had important therapeutic value. Her principal message was that psychiatrists who dipped in once a week could not really be very helpful. If anyone could rescue the children, it was the counselors, who stood watch 24 hours a day in the school so that he and the consulting psychiatrist became the children's primary therapists. He eventually would write, without doubting the merits, for less disturbed children, of institutional settings relying on psychiatric or casework sessions for therapy. We have found that such a separation of function between the separate or residential worker and therapist does not work well with extremely disturbed children. Being repeatedly bitten, kicked, defecated upon or otherwise abused results in defensive or punitive actions, cold indifference, emotional distance. Such attitudes interfere with rehabilitation. They can be avoided only if staff members know it is their responsibility, and only theirs, to help these children. If they receive all the narcissistic and interpersonal rewards that derive from being the children's main therapists. Superscript 1 Sylvester collaborated with Bettelheim on 6 journal articles that went a long way toward defining the new orthogenic school for the profession and establishing Bettelheim's early reputation in the field of residential treatment. They were the first authors in the American literature to use the term therapeutic milieu to describe the kind of all-encompassing healing atmosphere they sought to develop. Superscript 1 Bettelheim and Sylvester wrote that one-on-one therapy was adequate for adults, but had only limited efficacy in treating troubled children, and maintained that such children could not be helped successfully while still living with their parents. They argued that real personality change is best initiated in an environment where the child faces the realistic consequences of his acting out and is protected at the same time from the self-destructive implications of his behavior. Superscript 1 Sylvester was absolutely crucial for the beginning of the school, said Gail Schulenberger, who became head counselor in the early years. Bettelheim himself singled out his countrywoman for developing and shaping therapeutic practice at the school and for influencing the actions and the viewpoints of staff members so extensively that it would be difficult to acknowledge each of her contributions specifically. Superscript 1 Despite this recognition, Sylvester felt that Bettelheim never adequately credited her for helping him establish the orthogenic school's new direction, and for years harbored bitter memories of her involvement with him. He was a very bright guy, no doubt about it, she told me. But he was also a bad character, full of a lust for power, an absolute monarch, always manipulating people, the kids at the school, the staff, his collaborators. He was a typical Viennese. In Chicago, he got in touch with the university crowd, and all of a sudden he became the boy who knew everything about analysis. He used people as long as he needed to off. In 1950, Sylvester left Chicago to pursue what would become a successful career in the Bay Area. In private practice and as a professor of clinical psychology at Stanford Medical School. Her successor as the school's principal psychiatrist was a mild-mannered Bostonian named George Perkins, a competent therapist whom everybody liked and respected but who gave off no competing old-world sparks. Whatever the contributions of Emmy Sylvester and others to the therapeutic milieu at the orthogenic school, Bettelheim soon gave it an interpretation very much his own. He said repeatedly over the years that his commitment to saving the children stemmed from his camp experience, from his anger at the idea of wasted lives. Whether trapped behind metal or emotional barbed wire. Superscript 1 He was determined to give the children a good life and hoped that by promoting their integration he could promote his own. That by serving the living he could, as much as possible, meet his obligation to the dead. Superscript 1 He said he recognized that mental patients, particularly troubled children, lent themselves easily to the gratification of infantile and megalomaniac rescue fantasies. But he assured his readers that this pitfall was minimized by his psychoanalytic training. Superscript 1 The former prisoner wrote that he had entered Dachau believing that nothing compared to psychoanalysis when it came to freeing the individual and guiding him toward an integrated and happier life, but had emerged from Buchenwald with serious doubts. He had come to question one of the discipline's main tenets, that the personality-shaping influence of the immediate family is all-important, and that society in the broader sense is relatively negligible by comparison. Superscript 1 He said that, once inside the camps, He quickly came to believe that an environment could turn personality upside down, producing more radical change than psychoanalysis, and more quickly. If the personalities of prisoners disintegrated in the cruel atmosphere of the camps, Bettelheim argued, then a loving milieu could play a key role in reintegrating the broken personalities in his care. Thus, he sought to recreate the orthogenic school in the reverse image of the camps. To make it a place where the doors were locked against the outside but the children could walk away at any time. Inevitably, some did from time to time, but the school's policy was to understand this impulse and to welcome back runaways without punishment.
Bettelheim's camp school construct would become a permanent edifice on the landscape of his thought and whatever's. Maintaining he initially hesitated to publish what he had discovered. Superscript 1 He did so in 1956. Echoing his 1943 essay on the camps with an article titled Schizophrenia as a Reaction to Extreme Situations. He maintained that childhood psychosis was due to spontaneous developmental forces that produced mortal anxiety. When he asked himself what set this process in motion, he answered that he had seen a whole range of autistic and schizophrenic reactions among his fellow camp inmates, behavior he attributed to the fact that they found themselves totally overpowered. So, too, were the school's schizophrenic children. He said that he had found again and again that the cause of childhood schizophrenia was the child's subjective feeling of living permanently in an extreme situation, that is, of being totally helpless in the face of threats to his very life. Superscript 2 degrees Bettelheim would come back to this theme many times over the years, in one case invoking Tote's huge, Paul Celan's poem about the death camps. With its recurrent reference to black milk of dawn we drink you at night we drink you at noon. Death is a master from Germany. Superscript 2 Superscript 1 Most critics interpreted this image as an allusion to the clouds of smoke issuing from the crematories. Superscript 2 Bettelheim felt it represented a mother destroying her infant, whether one was a prisoner required to drink black milk from dawn to dusk in Auschwitz, or a child in the luxurious crib facing the unconscious death wishes of his mother. The living soul has death for a master. Superscript 2 Superscript 3 Bettelheim sought to support this conclusion and his other findings. Superscript 2 4 In the 1956 article, much as he had his observations in individual and mass behavior in extreme situations, with ex cathedra pronouncements, generalizations, and anecdotes, he said that he had observed practically all types of schizophrenic adaptations and symptomatology in the camps, including delusions, catatonia, depression, megalomania, suicidal tendencies, and suicides themselves. He stated flatly, loss of memory was universal, as were shallow and inappropriate emotions. Superscript 2 5 When confronted by the literature on camp psychology that had accumulated since he had staked his claim to the subject in 1943, he looked away. In 1949, the psychoanalyst Edith Jacobson published a clinical study of women prisoners that came to far less sweeping and dogmatic conclusions than Bettelheim did. She found that, in general, those citizens who arrived in camp with stable personalities did not disintegrate. Her observations appeared in Searchlights on Delinquency, a collection of 30 for psychoanalytic studies reviewed. He wrote in passing that he felt aged its content nor allowed her research or anyone else's in the years to come to impinge on his 1943 assessment of camp behavior. Superscript 2 6 Readers had to take him on faith, as they did when he said that the orthogenic school children were schizophrenic and had become so because, like the inmates, they feared for their lives. As the only evidence to buttress this thesis, he supplied 3 excerpts from case histories, one about a boy whose parents talked in his presence about sending him to an institution and who fantasized about how he would torture and kill others before they could kill him, another about an adopted boy who, before the age of 3, chanced to see a man in an adulterous situation with his mother, who threatened to kill the child if he ever revealed what he knew, and a third about a boy with delusions of persecution that stemmed from the fact that his older brother and some friends had made him the object of a hanging game, after which he had to be revived by artificial respiration. Superscript 2 7 The idea of rebirth was central to Bettelheim's camp school equation. He saw regression in autistic and schizophrenic children as their plea to be reborn, to start over on a road to a better life. He compared this to the daydreams of his fellow prisoners, who, in their own regression, frequently fantasized about starting life over should they be lucky enough to gain their freedom. Bettelheim maintained that only those former prisoners who were able to establish a new beginning fully overcame the damaging influence of the camp's superscript to 8 thus, as the Patrick Zimmerman, the coordinator of research at the Orthogenic School, would suggest in a 1993 assessment of Bettelheim's thought, his work with children was both shaped and limited by his own experience as a man who, in his early years as director of the Orthogenic School, was transforming himself in the eyes of the public from a Viennese upper-middle-class businessman to a self-trained psychoanalyst. Superscript to Bettelheim's apodictic style and the lack of hard evidence for most of his claims came to characterize much of his writing. This would bring him criticism from the therapeutic establishment over the years, especially from psychiatrists, but he waved it away. He told his friend, the Hungarian-born psychologist David Rappaport, that he felt hemmed in by psychoanalytic theory and that he learned more about the children at his school by carefully observing them. Superscript 3 degrees. He said repeatedly that he regarded psychoanalysis less as a science than as an art, and when an interviewer asked him, late in his life, about his lack of scientific rigor, he replied that after observing the patient he trusted his unconscious to supply an idea that could be refined into a way of treatment. He said the abstractions that science requires are contrary to the uniqueness of man as a psychologist. He asserted, has it been said that the poets understand man more deeply, more penetratingly than the so-called scientist. Superscript 3 Superscript 1 The poet in Bettelheim likened the Orthogenic School to the sanatorium atop the Magic Mountain, an institution also run by a Dr. B. with an eye for art. Thomas Mann. Dr. Berendt takes in the tubercular young German engineer Hans Kostorp, who stayed more than 7 years, breathing the cleansing air in a timeless universe high above the ominous politics of Europe before the Great War. Bettelheim said that he, too, aimed to create a home out of time and away from the world's concerns, where both the children and the staff could gulp the unique curative powers of his therapeutic milieu. Superscript 3 Superscript 2 Central to this process were regular staff meetings. Sessions that usually proved a good deal less jam-like than the cozy, late-night gatherings in the basement kitchen, and that reverberated with Bettelheim's conviction that a man's work must be permeated by his personality. Superscript 3 Often in the early years, Dr. B presided over these meetings from an easy chair at one end of the overstuffed first-floor living room, sometimes pulling tissues from a box at his elbow and folding them neatly down the arm in anticipation of an attack of hay fever. He said once that he didn't know why he was so allergic, but figured it was cheaper to buy antihistamines and Kleenex than suffer the expense of being analyzed again. Joseph Wingo recalled. He required that all counselors regularly dictate descriptions of the children's behavior, and their reactions to it, into tape recorders, and he usually arrived at the staff meetings with typed transcripts, which rested in his lap like so many sentencing decrees. Well, he would announce, his mother tongue converting the W to a V, his thick lenses scanning the pages and then sweeping the room. If no one spoke, he often plunged into a passage of dictation. For example, Joseph Wingo had reported, Pete walked into the dormitory and threw his model airplane on the floor. I said, if you don't like it anymore, I'll be glad to keep it for you. He kicked the pieces to splinters. Daniel said, he's always breaking things. He's just trying to uproar you, Josette. The other kids gathered around the table for their snacks. Want a piece of cake, Pete? You know I hate cake. You know I hate chocolate. It's shitty. I shrugged my shoulders. Why did you shrug your shoulders? Bettelheim asked Wingo. Her tongue was pinioned by the question. She thought she had done well not to let Pete get to her. He was being too... Why, Wingo? The matter unresolved, Bettelheim changed the subject to Pete's hat. Our most neurotic parents would never let a child go out in a hat that makes him look like Happy Hooligan out of the funny papers, he said. He seemed furious, and it was now quite clear to Wingo that she must do something about the hat, but whether the sound psychological reasons were Pete's self-image or Dr. Lee's dislike of arsenical yellow, green plank wool caps with ear flaps was beyond the scope of the discussion. Lots of things were. When to shut up, when to speak up, when to put up. I put up my finger and held it up to the wind, trying to decide whether to tack or jump. Superscript 3 for such heavy sailing was routine at the staff meetings throughout the 3 decades Bettelheim ran the Orthogenic school. Just before he retired as director in 1973, he allowed Daniel Harlin, a French filmmaker, to shoot a documentary at the school. The scene at a staff meeting shows him sitting on a couch, a stern father talking while the counselors, most of them young women, look about apprehensively. His tone says, "Why don't you understand this, you dummies?" His acolytes look chastened as he dismisses their minds. There are many pauses, during which everyone seems afraid to talk, to risk saying the wrong thing and being savaged by the master. Superscript 3.5 He was very cruel to the staff, Carlin told me. Simone was about to turn 20 when she joined the school's staff in the late 1940s. You never knew what the agenda would be, she recalled. You weren't sure whether you were going to get a kudo or a brick. That Bettelheim occasionally praised a counselor for an insight in her dictation, the way she had calmed a child's tantrum in the dining room, but mostly he was the Viennese taskmaster, sitting in judgment of how the counselors handled the children, making the staff feel stupid. Then they failed to see what to him was the obvious reason for a child's behavior. If he thought a counselor lacked control in a situation, he would ask, "Are you trying to make this kid crazier?" His sarcasm drenching the room. "You had the feeling you were a piece of shit, that you didn't know anything," said Mary Cann, who, at 22, became a counselor for about a year in the 1950s. Some staff members realized that Bettelheim's growls were occasionally an act, a wandering circus put on by one of the greatest performers of all time to get them to remember what he was trying to teach them. Superscript 3.6 Still, the big bad wolf, as he sometimes called himself, could be a very convincing beast when he employed his instruction through terror. Superscript 3.7 Or what Robert Bergman, who spent 6 months at the school when he was a psychiatric. Superscript 3.8 with steps. Determination to dissect not just the children's behavior but the counselors as well. He saw the sessions as instruments for challenging staff members to confront themselves. Superscript 3 insisting that they could not help the children unless they understood their own psychopathology. He also saw the school's therapeutic milieu as an eminently suitable for degrees setting for helping the counselors solve childhood conflicts. He would get into your parents, your brother, your whole personality, recalled Shelton Keep, a counselor and teacher at the school from 1953 to 1962, who often was so shaken after evening staff sessions that he could not sleep. Few of the staff meetings ended without at least one of the women in tears and several others fighting them back. When there was a staff meeting before lunch, recalled one former resident, you would see many staff members come into the dining room with eyes red from crying off for superscript 1, yet most of the tearful young women remained in Bettelheim's thrall, turning the Orthogenic school into something of a heaven. He relished having young, pliable, agreeable, passionate women around, said Anne Morissette, a counselor for 18 months in the late 1940s. Leslie Orno, a counselor during Bettelheim's last years at the school, felt that he had an intense need to be unambiguously adored and that many of the female counselors reciprocated by making him their father figure. When these dutiful daughters repaired to the neighborhood's Cornell Lounge for a restorative drink or two after a long day with the children, they seemed unable to talk of anything but Daddy, who, they joked, was eavesdropping on every word through microphones he had hidden in the plastic flowers near their dark booth. In Mary Cann's view, most of the counselors were madly in love with him. He was a cult figure for them. The atmosphere was always exciting and tense, sexually charged. The school was known as the nunnery, because you were married to Bettelheim but never had sex with him. What many counselors did have with him was individual therapy. In the first years, Gail Schulenberger, Simone, Patty Pickett, and several others spent an hour or two a week in his small office pouring out their troubles, and in the decades that followed many more, most of them young women, would do the same, some for many months. Even before they put themselves in Bettelheim's hands, he had accessed their emotional V-type. When hiring, He often asked for psychological resumes, like those he had solicited from his students at Rockford. He urged would-be counselors to skip their student council and glee club triumphs and tell him instead of their childhood traumas, of their sexual anxieties, of how they felt about their parents. Such baggage in his office was irresistible to tell all to such a magnetic personality. Foursquare, a man many of the counselors believed held a degree in psychology from the University of Vienna and was a trained analyst who had traveled in Freud's circle. That the confessors worked for their analytic priest gave some of them pause, but in the early years especially, there seemed ample precedent for rationalization. After all, hadn't Freud analyzed his friends Maxie Eddington and Sander Franks, and Franks his professional associate Ernest Jones? It was in this intramural atmosphere that Melanie Klein analyzed her children and Freud his daughter Anna. Besides, many of the counselors believed that the sessions shored them up. "I don't know what I would have done without his help," said Patty Pickett, who credits Bettelheim with showing her how to cope with a critical family problem when she was at the school. "I did lie down on his couch," said Go for me Boney, a counselor in the 1960s who would become a mental health professional. "I had confidence that he would understand what I had to say, that he could help me solve problems. He made you feel that you deserved to be put together." Those who justified the sessions argued, like Bettelheim himself, that working at the orthogenic school was so charged emotionally that the counselors needed a regular opportunity to decompress, to air out their psychological conflicts. Like the guilt that often overwhelmed them when they grew angry at the vulnerable but difficult children they were supposed to learn and nurture. When such anxieties proved counterproductive at more conventional residential treatment centers, the staff member was usually dismissed. Bettelheim provided a sympathetic ear instead. Few disputed that the counselors needed some kind of therapeutic hearing, but not everyone thought the best place for it was in the Freudian shadows of Bettelheim's inner sanctum. Bertram J. Kohler, who attended the orthogenic school in the 1950s and subsequently became a counselor and, briefly, associate director under Bettelheim, was appalled that the all-powerful, charismatic master saw his young, insecure employees in treatment. Kohler, who would become a professor of education, psychology, and psychiatry at the University of Chicago, told me that Bettelheim dismissed his concern, insisting that what he was doing was not treatment but dynamic supervision, by whatever name. The practice inevitably set the staff roiling with sibling rivalry as counselors basked in the status of being on Bettelheim's couch or sulked because he had not found their neuroses worthy of his inspection. "I don't really know how he carried it off, because it aroused so much ambivalence among the staff," recalled Karen Carlson, who became one of Bettelheim's favorite counselors in the 1950s and 1960s and would co-author on learning to read in the two fields he helped her in therapy, especially now an experienced therapist herself. However, she looks back with a certain reluctant disapproval on her mentor her employer's performance. To Kohler, who infuriated Bettelheim by refusing to lie down on his couch, the director's main motivation was control. Counselors inevitably discussed what went on at the school at their sessions with Bettelheim, who was not above using what he learned in confidence to confront other counselors, sometimes in staff meetings. "I so idealized him at the time," said Robert Bergman, "that I was not sophisticated enough to realize the practice was a big mistake." Like Freud with Anna, Dr. B thought he could carry it off because he was a genius. To former counselor Ben Wright, Bettelheim was an obsessed puppet master who lived through many of his women counselor patients and they threw him. Few staff members would dance as loyally on Bettelheim's strings as Jacqueline Seebeck, who arrived at the orthogenic school in 1952 fresh out of Radcliffe College. About the only good thing Bettelheim had to say about her at their first meeting was that she did not wear red fingernail polish, which he said frightened adolescent boys. "I came to his office dressed and groomed as I thought appropriate for the first interview with a new employer," recalled Seebeck. "He evidently didn't think so. He told me I should leave off my Radcliffe manners. My voice was too soft. It was full of holes." He complained that I had changed since the picture that I had sent to him had been taken. To add clear emphasis to his perspective, he called into his office and gave me as a guide for a tour of the school a young woman who was a caricature of a typical University of Chicago student, a chain-smoking, unkempt, uncombed, unlipsticked brilliant philosopher. For cubed like many prospective counselors, Seebeck had been drawn to Bettelheim after reading individual and mass behavior in extreme situations, which had made her cry. She managed to muster her courage and return to the Wolf's Den the next day, in part because she was curious about how such a heartless,
how such a heartless maniac had been able to move her so with his writing. At the second interview, Bettelheim won her over completely by telling her what almost every 21-year-old secretly wants to hear, that everything that might be wrong with me was dear old mommy's fault. He allowed that. She was now looking more like her picture, apologized for being so critical the day before, and said that her soft voice was doubtless a reaction to her mother's loud and harsh one. At the time, these insights seemed almost magical to Seebeck. How could this man possibly know so much about her and her family? In her thrall, she had forgotten that only a few months before she had sent him, along with the photograph, the requisite psycho-autobiography, which told him a good deal about her poor maligned mother. Seebeck would stay at the school for 13 years, becoming one of its most dedicated counselors, and before long Bettelheim's principal deputy, the workhorse of the staff. Director, working endless hours and spilling out her tearful emotions in sessions of dynamic supervision that stretched over many months. Bettelheim's penchant for exploitive and often tyrannical behavior was far from the surface, yet from the beginning he demonstrated a parallel capacity for insight and empathy. Not long after Seebeck arrived at the school, she came into the dining room with a group of children, several of them out of control. She was unable to handle the situation and felt deeply distressed that her incompetence was on display not only for her new employer, but for the children and staff as well. She left the room in tears. "Jackie," Bettelheim said, he caught up with her, "you have a very important decision to make." Prepared for the worst, the 21-year-old newcomer tried to pull herself together. "Will you have beer or an ice cream cone?" he said. Bettelheim had a shark-like smile that made more than one staff member feel that he cruised the school like a wrathful god, and that even if she could not recall having done anything wrong, there was always the possibility she had forgotten about something. But he also had a much more tentative, interested grin that beamed on at the late-night informal bantering sessions. He also had a big laugh. Sandy Lewis, who attended the school in the 50s and remained entwined with Bettelheim for years afterward, recalled how he made self-deprecatory remarks about his homeliness. "But to me as a child the man was beautiful," Lewis told me. "When he laughed his big laugh the whole school was happy." This mood often came with corny one-liners, like his oft-repeated observation that he knew 3 things but could remember just 2 at any given time. Or his suggestion to Seebeck that she open a fundraising talk by referring to a new book about the school as "Love is Not Enough, It Takes Money Too." The director came to the rescue of his anxious staff again and again, often in unexpected and unorthodox ways. Harry, the boy who had thrown the carving knife at Gail Schulenberger, also manifested his violent streak by making a shambles of his dorm room. The son of a drunken father, he tried to copy his parents' alcoholic rampages by repeatedly toppling the furniture, including the bunk beds. One afternoon, he returned to the dorm and discovered to his amazement that the tables, chests, and bunks, everything but the chairs, had been bolted to the walls or floor. He was infuriated, Bettelheim wrote, but this very frustrating experience turned out to be also quite constructive. For the first time Harry found himself prevented from getting a misdeed without having been physically restrained, threatened by punishment, or actually punished. Despite his anger, he realized school children's well-being, while at the same time they made special arrangements to avoid the use of restraint. Another case that demonstrated Bettelheim's rejection of conventional solutions involved a boy who refused to go to the toilet and had become so constipated that he no longer moved his bowels at all. In desperation, several counselors took him to the university's Billings Hospital, across the Midway, where doctors reamed him up with mineral oil as he screamed in pain. A trauma not only for the child, but for the helpless young women as well. Bettelheim listened to their agonized account at a staff meeting and then asked, did it occur to anybody to tell the poor boy that he could go in his pants, or in his bed? It had not, to the counselors or to Jerome Kafka, the psychiatric consultant present at the session. He demonstrated to us, Kafka told me, that we were, like the rest of the world, too preoccupied with cleanliness, which kept us from doing the right thing in this case. Bettelheim liked to remind the staff that in Vienna shopkeepers always greeted customers by asking, politely, "How may I serve you?" That was the message he wanted the children to get, maintaining that too often psychotherapists in the United States assumed they knew it all and their patients knew nothing. Bettelheim insisted that staff members put themselves in the child's place. Try to understand his seemingly incomprehensible behavior by imagining what they might be feeling if they were to act in a similar fashion. Robert Bergman recalled a counselor who reported that a child had become upset over the way she had touched her. Bettelheim teased out that she had touched the child tentatively and with some anxiety. He got her to think about how she would feel if she were with a young man she liked and he had touched her that way. One of his favorite questions was, how would you feel if you discovered someone you loved sitting on top of a flagpole? Fledgling counselors looked at one another in bewilderment, not eager to hazard a reply. Few of them guessed that the answer their teacher sought was that they should have faith in the climbers' reasons for being up there. Bettelheim also liked to say that the end isn't the beginning, by which he meant that the attitudes counselors brought to their interactions with the children often determined how those interactions would play out. One child, Sammy, walked hesitantly to his sessions with a counselor named Diana Grossman, and paused before the door of the room where they were about to talk. Bettelheim explained that the session had actually begun when Grossman picked up Sammy in the classroom, and that every step he took lagging behind her while she impatiently preceded him had communicated to him whose session it was and who was in charge. Thereafter, Grossman began waiting for Sammy to go ahead of her at every step, giving him a if he continued to hang back and never several times over the years. Bettelheim described how he had charge of the school to discover a huge meat cleaver on his desk, with a note that he said read, "This time it's on your desk. Next time it'll be in your head." In one telling, the cleaver had been used to break into the candy closet, which his predecessor, Mandel Sherman, had kept locked, doling out the contents as he saw fit. In another version, Bettelheim said he had already taken the lock off, but the children had not felt free to come in and help themselves because the closet was behind an imposing desk in Sherman's large and intimidating office, which Bettelheim was still using. He said he had planned to take a more modest space, but in the crush of the transition had decided the move could wait. The meat cleaver inside and convinced him that the size of the chamber, its muscular furniture, and the location of the candy symbolized the oppressive atmosphere of the previous regime. Superscript 1 Bettelheim soon settled into a small office just off the entrance to the building and re-established historic suites outside his immediate orbit. Any child could raid this trove whenever she wished and was free to carry off as many Hershey bars, Chuckles, Baby Ruths, cookies, and assorted other confections as she liked, no questions asked. "We have found," Bettelheim wrote, in a characteristic rejection of orthodox parental thinking, that candy eaten shortly before night, and that even when it does, the children's health does not suffer. "We do not care when or what they eat, whether they eat mainly at meals, or in between. Our chief concern is that eating itself become a pleasure to them." Square the daily fare at the school was ample and nourishing, and the children themselves chose menu several times a month. Cubed at dinner, bowls full of steaming mashed potatoes and peas and carrots poured forth from the kitchen, along with platters of chicken or meatloaf, plenty of bread and butter, and often cake or ice cream for dessert. Bettelheim had nothing but disdain for the trays and cafeteria lines of most institutions. The kitchen staff served boarding house style, shuttling to and from the dining room several tables, at each of which sat a counselor or teacher with about half a dozen children. No diner had to fear being treated like Oliver Twist. If he wanted more, empty serving bowls were quickly replenished. Bettelheim was determined that the dining room, like the rest of the school, have a homey atmosphere. He insisted on the use of quality china at every place setting and eventually would choose the wallpaper himself as well, dark-skinned ballerinas dancing in blue tutus against a gray background. He was fond of saying, "Da Liebe durch den Magen, love goes through the stomach." But, like so many therapists of his generation, he seemed compelled to make such common-sense observations carry a heavy Freudian load. He wrote that psychoses were often caused by a regression to early oral fixations. Thus it was at mealtime that these old traumas could be countered by corrective emotional experiences that would help rebuild the personality. At no time did a warmer atmosphere envelop the school than at Christmas, a holiday that grew increasingly lavish over the years and usually turned Bettelheim into a doting paterfamilias. He relished going downtown to Marshall Fields and acquiring the most expensive Santa Claus suit for a counselor to wear. Or to another favorite store in the Loop where he spent generously on hundreds of foreign-made toy soldiers. As December 25th approached, weary counselors stayed up night after night sewing stuffed animals and dolls, making marzipan scratch, and transforming the playroom into a fairyland hung with bulging stockings. Bettelheim believed that anyone who cannot thoroughly enjoy buying a gift for somebody who plays an important role in his life had better give up working intimately with people. But he could be an irritating stickler for making sure a present was just right. Sometimes criticizing counselors for getting a child a Raggedy Ann doll when, in his view, a toy stove would have been more psychologically appropriate. Run to his office and rummage through the store of gifts and substitute. Not long before one Christmas in the 50s, Bettelheim and Sanders were commiserating about two difficult children the school had had to give up on. They decided that everyone needed cheering up and arranged for a secret Santa Claus to arrive early at critical moments with presents to boost the staff's morale. When a counselor arrived to decorate the front hall banister, she found a corsage waiting for her. On the night before the children's Christmas party, when the staff worked into the morning making preparations, one exhausted member found an Easter bunny costume with instructions that he dress up in it and distribute Easter presents to his fellow elves. And one year, Bettelheim decided that the secret Santa should leave a stocking and a present for each staff member to find in the living room before he or she went to the playroom for the children's gift. Opening, Bettelheim himself provided funds for the presents and many of the ideas, and the secret Santa became a tradition that lasted several years. Signaled by the mysterious appearance of a large stuffed reindeer in the director's office chair. Lou Harper, who ran the teaching staff at the school for 2 decades, knew the spirit of Christmas better than Bettelheim. As he would spell out when writing about fairy tales, Bettelheim saw magical thinking as a boost to a child's development, and that very much included the belief in Santa Claus. When a mother told a 5-year-old boy that there was no such person and instructed him instead in the abstract spirit of giving, good elf who wants nothing in return, which is why he comes in the middle of the night. We need to realize, as our children do, that there is a great difference between accepting presents from some sprite who wants no gratitude and exchanging presents with thank yous all around. At the end of 1947, Bettelheim reported that 25 boys and 8 girls boarded at the school, organized in dormitories of 4 to 8 beds. He listed the principal reasons for their referrals as delinquency 18, feeble-mindedness or severe retardation, behavior disorders of a schizophrenic nature 4, neurotic deafness 2, and an inability to read 2. He said that 11 of these children produced regular and severe temper tantrums, 15 showed academic retardation, 28 displayed psychosomatic disturbances ranging from bulimia and anorexia to stuttering and tics, and 4 had attempted suicide. The quarterly fee for boarding students was $750, and the full-time staff now numbered 33, among them a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker, 10 counselors, 4 teachers, a registered nurse, a seamstress, and the kitchen, maintenance, and office workers. Most of the children came from the Chicago area, an increasing number from middle and upper-class families, several of them wealthy and most of them well-educated. As a result of Bettelheim's new admissions policies, the collective intelligence of the residents had begun to rise. He said their IQs now ranged from 90 to 157, with the preponderance just above average. Academic education took place every weekday between 9 a.m. and 3 midnight in what amounted to a one-room schoolhouse. The teachers not only had to tailor lessons for children of varying ages and abilities, but to cope with the paroxysms of rage and other emotional shrapnel that flew about the classroom almost daily. The children worked at their own pace, one boy struggling with simple addition while a girl of the same age raced through the multiplication tables. Whatever a pupil's capacity for learning, his emotional well-being came first. If a task proved too frustrating, Lou Harper would assure him that it was not the most important issue in his life at the moment. A child who felt the work too threatening could, without fear of censure, spend his time in class playing on the linoleum floor with blocks or, in some cases, skip school altogether until he felt confident enough to return. To reduce pressure, no homework assignments were made. To minimize competition, no marks were given. With some amusement, Myrna Adams, who entered the school in 1940, taught what grade they were in. Progress was always uneven, but occasionally almost magical. One 12-year-old boy who refused to read suddenly became entranced by the yearling, which Lou Harper had been reading to him. When I was finished, he asked me to read it again. I said, "No, you have to read it yourself now." And so he began. In 1948, R. Wendell Harrison, the Dean of Faculties at the University of Chicago, asked F. Howell Wright, head of pediatrics, for his assessment of developments at the Orthogenic school. Wright, who at Bettelheim's request had agreed to treat the children's medical problems and would continue to do so for almost 40 years, replied that on the basis of limited observation he had found the new principal's stewardship far superior to Mandel Sherman's and described him as an intense, hard-working, intellectually honest individual who has a considerable interest in children. Wright felt something very important and valuable was taking place at the school and lamented that no mechanism had been established to permit medical students, pediatric interns, residents, and the attending staff at Billings Hospital to observe the school's milieu therapy regularly. Superscript 1. Wright did note that he had heard Bettelheim had a volatile temper and sometimes lost control of himself. He told me that he himself was never on the receiving end of such outbursts, stressing that Bettelheim always treated him with immoderate respect. A deference Wright suggested stemmed from a refugee Jew's insecurity in the presence of a Gentile who held an important post at the university and was also a medical doctor. Though Bettelheim installed Drive in front of his name soon after taking over the Orthogenic school, when Wright greeted him with that honorific he sometimes corrected him by saying, with self-deprecating sarcasm, "Mr. Bettelheim." Wright felt that anyone overseeing a residential treatment center for emotionally disturbed children had every conceivable alibi for exploding from time to time. But some actual targets of the new director's wrath were less understanding. A year after Bettelheim took over the school, Robert M. Hutchins received a letter from a mother after she and her husband had met with Bettelheim to discuss whether they should enroll their son, who they felt had a reading disability. "We were completely astonished," she told the chancellor, "by the discourteous sick reception and his rude, sarcastic answers to our question. When we finally asked to see the school, he became violently angry, burst into a tirade about the place not being a zoo, and acted like a man who thought he was being spied upon. We came to the quick conclusion that the school with such a principal was no place for our child or any other child, but puts on such a but he is evidently unaware that American parents consider it their right to be inquisitive about an environment in which they may put their child. However, the important part of the affair is that it seems inevitable that his lack of emotional stability, his sadistic determination to make us uncomfortable must be present in his dealing with the children under his care." Squared Bettelheim defended his behavior by telling Hutchins, who had asked him how to respond to the mother, that she had insisted not only on touring the school, but on talking to the children. in order to persuade herself that they were much inferior to her son. He said he refused to let her see the children, because he feared she would upset them. Cubed Hutchins let the matter slide. The mother's behavior may have been as demanding as Bettelheim suggested, and his decision not to let her invade the children's domain a valid one. But his intemperate assaults were not limited to this woman, and early on they troubled some campus administrators. A 1948 confidential memorandum reported that the dean of the university's School of Social Service Administration had found, along with her staff, that Bettelheim was incapable of appropriate parent orientation, or not interested in it. The staff was reluctant to recommend financial support for the orthogenic school because of the shock treatment he inflicted on parents.
Telling them when they enrolled their child that it was his decision, and his alone, as to when they would next see their son or daughter, and whether they would have to settle for a few hours over the weekend or could hope for longer reunion in their home. 64. Bettelheim generally opposed the latter, maintaining that such home visits often unraveled, if only temporarily, the progress the child had made. This was undoubtedly true in some cases, but the prolonged separations inevitably had other traumatic consequences as well. Myrna Adams recalled being taken to the school by her mother in 1948 and having no idea why. After entering the front door, the terrified 8-year-old was told to wait in a room, where a counselor eventually explained that she would be staying. That was the last time I saw my mother for at least a year, Adams told me. Helen Martinson, whose daughter Dorothy attended the school during Bettelheim's first years there, said that he seemed determined to make mothers feel guilty, and if he could make us weep, that was better. He viewed parents, particularly mothers, not only the chief obstacle to overcoming them. I consider my role as attorney for the child. Let the parents get their own attorney, he said. 65. Even some of his most devout counselors came to regard his policy as at best misguided and at worst cruel. But as Joan Little pointed out, then they first began working at the school, they were growing away from their own mothers and fathers. Blaming parents in general for the psychological woes of their offspring had a certain easy attraction, especially if it was encouraged during one-on-one sessions with the boss. Bettelheim's conviction that parents were at the root of most childhood mental disorders found a good deal of support in the psychoanalytic tradition. Sigmund Freud had never met the mother of his famous hysteric, Dora. But in his 1905 monograph about the teenager, he wrote that he was led to imagine by her and her father's testimony that the mother was an uncultivated and foolish woman who had no understanding of children because she concentrated on domestic chores. A preoccupation Freud called her housewife's psychosis. 66. This sort of patronizing position, rarely buttressed by any evidence, would harden into received truth in the decades that followed, sometimes offered in the thoughtful, sympathetic language of such experts on the family as D.W. Winnicott, John Bowlby, and Benjamin Spock, other times delivered as stern indictments by psychoanalysts like David Levy and Renee Spitz. As late as 1965, Spitz would write in his book The First Year of Life that phenomena like colic and eczema were psychotoxic diseases of infancy, provoked by the mother's personality. 67. At about the same time, a doctor at Harvard Medical School argued that having children deeply distressed women because it confirmed their femaleness, which they secretly abhorred. Thus, they felt compelled to disown motherhood by destroying their offspring. He conceded that most mothers did not murder or even totally reject their children, but contended that death pervades the relationship. 68. Such mother-bashing grew in intensity after World War II, reflecting a widespread anxiety that something was going wrong with America or Americans. 6. In the 1920s, the concept of permissiveness had entered the nursery and begun to replace the 19th century belief that properly raising children required strict discipline. Some 2 million men had been rejected or discharged from the military for psychiatric reasons. A few experts suggested that the new permissiveness just might be responsible for their inability to cooperate. When the war ended, millions more servicemen came home to face an uncertain job future and to discover that women, who had helped build warships and airplanes, had also run the household quite well on their own. This had left these housewives just getting underway on advertising's seductive English point out in For Her Own Good, their trenchant analysis of 150 years of experts' advice to women. The idea that women had achieved any real social or economic power was an illusion. That if anything they had reached the nadir for the 20th century. 7 degrees nonetheless. Many men saw women as the cause of post-war America's problems. They felt emasculated and regarded women as a growing threat, afflicted very often with penis envy. In the words of Ferdinand Lundberg. 7 superscript 1 in his 1942 bestseller, Generation of Vipers, Philip Wiley had turned mom into an accusative, writing that megaloid momhership has got completely out of hand. 7 superscript 2. It was in this atmosphere that Bettelheim picked up the megaphone that would make him, over 3 decades, the profession's loudest advocate for the mom as villain diagnosis. There was and is no shortage of evidence showing that some parents or their surrogates mistreat children in myriad ways, and that their behavior, whether willfully cruel or merely misguided, can have a profound impact. Gail Schulenberger recalled that Harry, the boy who had thrown the knife at her, had been held from a third-floor window in his foster home and told that he would be dropped if he kept misbehaving. Other children at the Orthogenic school had come from dark backgrounds as well, but many were raised by basically affectionate parents who did the best job they knew how, only to discover that something they could not explain had gone wrong with their children. By the time they arrived at Bettelheim's door, they usually were desperate, and when he told them to leave their children and go away, they sheepishly withdrew, always confused and sometimes quaking. Erwin and Selma Angres, whose son Ronald entered the school in 1959 at age 7, recalled Bettelheim telling them soon afterward that a Rorschach test had indicated he was a very sick boy. Angres, the psychoanalyst, told the director that he and his wife were well aware of that, which was why they had come to him. As was his practice, Bettelheim told them that they could not look around the school and that they might not see their son again for many months. I remember standing by the window of his office, and for the first time in maybe 20 years, I cried. Erwin Angres told me. Bettelheim gave him a tissue and consoled him, said that the sharp break was necessary and the situation would look better after some time had passed. After several months, Selma Angres asked if Ronald could come home to be with his siblings for Easter. When they were out of school, Bettelheim agreed to the visit, but not before reminding the couple that, though their 3 other children might be in school, Ronald was in a booby hatch. He would remain there for 12 years, after which the Angreses withdrew him against the director's advice, Chicago lawyer and businessman, and his troubled teenage daughter. DeVoe had helped raise thousands of dollars for the Orthogenic school and had come to revere Bettelheim as a gifted therapist. He knew the director could be difficult, but nothing had prepared him for the onslaught that came after the couple laid out their daughter's emotional difficulties for the man they saw as her savior. He practically ruined Naomi, DeVoe told me. He told her in so many words that she was the cause of our daughter's problems, that our child must enter the school, and that he couldn't possibly tell us when we might see her again. He was an absolute brute, there is no question about it. Nonetheless, their daughter was soon living under Bettelheim's care. A few months after Bettelheim took over the Orthogenic school in 1944, he laid out ambitious plans to create the outstanding nationally known Center for the Treatment and Study of Emotionally Disturbed Children. 7 superscript 3 he called for research programs, scholarships for families who could not afford full tuition, fellowships to pay some staff members, and a new building to house the institution. These and additional goals would eventually require thousands of dollars, and the cash began to flow in immediately. In his first year, the school's budget almost doubled, to $64,000, largely as a result of a $20,000 gift from the Sonia Shankman Foundation, the memorial fund established by the family and friends of a Chicago woman who had died in 1936, at the age of 42. After many years devoted to helping children. 74 Carl DeVoe was a prime mover in the foundation, as was Philip Pica, a wealthy Chicago hotel owner whose daughter had attended the Orthogenic school during the Sherman years. PETA had sent out the fundraising letter in the summer of 1944, warning that the school was in parlous financial condition and that, as only one consequence, the children suffered from malnutrition. He was determined that the institution should survive, and regarded the hard-working Bettelheim, with his confident style and Freudian aura, as its redeemer. By 1949, the new principal's performance had so impressed the foundation that it agreed to make the institution its sole beneficiary and pledged $40,000 or more for 1950 and each succeeding year. A commitment that moved the University of Chicago to designate the home formerly the Sonia Shankman Orthogenic School. 75 The Family Fund renamed itself the Foundation for Emotionally Disturbed Children and began devoting itself exclusively to raising money for the school. Gifts came in from companies as well as individuals, and additional funds flowed from special events, such as a benefit performance of Fiddler on the Roof. On Clark Street, just north of the Louvre, an enterprise staffed by dedicated volunteers who send dollars annually, mostly for scholarships. Bettelheim gratefully accepted the auxiliaries' checks at its luncheons, telling his benefactors how crucial their work was for the school and how beautiful they all looked in their hats. He always stressed how successful he was in restoring the children to healthy, productive lives. 90% was his theme song, recalled Mel Pekersky, who helped oversee the FEDC fundraising for many years. He got whatever he wanted from them. They were in such awe of him that being in his presence was like having some kind of spiritual experience. To most of the women, and many of their husbands, he was both God and a genius, and the money rolled in. He was terrific, said Ben Wright, who sometimes accompanied Bettelheim on fundraising forays. He just made people feel good about giving him money. With the FEDC established, Bettelheim was now in a position to push hard for his goal, spelled out in his 1945 memorandum on the needs of the institution, of improving and expanding the physical plant. By 1950, the church and adjoining minister's house, never intended for use as a school in the first place, had deteriorated badly for lack of money to make repairs. Architectural plans already existed for the construction of 2 additional dormitory units and more space for classrooms, and ground was soon broken. Bettelheim believed that a good residential treatment center should fit the children's lives like a very comfortable old shoe 76, and to achieve that homey feeling, the new dormitory building was integrated into the rear of the rectory. With 3 dorm rooms for boys on the second floor and 2 for girls and 1 for boys on the first. The night counselor lived adjacent to each dorm. In all, the enlarged house now accommodated 14 counselors in small but comfortable rooms, most of them singles. 6 or 7 children slept in each dorm room, now in beds instead of the double-decker bunks that had been used to create more play space in their old, cramped quarters. Each child was free to arrange the furniture in her area as she liked, and dorm mates decided collectively on their room's decor, choosing from a variety of cheerful curtain patterns and paint colors laid out for them by their counselors and sometimes Bettelheim himself. If the children failed to reach consensus, painting one wall bright red, another pale blue, a third yellowish green, and the fourth purple was an altogether acceptable compromise. A multi-hued reflection of the art historian-turned-psychologist belief that anyone can feel that he is master of his fate if he cannot decide even such simple matters as the color of his walls or the design of his curtains. 77 The church, too, was substantially renovated, its sanctuary above the story, 5 small rooms for individual play sessions, and a craft shop and woodworking area. The school also boasted 3 playgrounds, 2 between the house and the church and 1 across Dorchester Avenue, with a jungle gym, sandbox, seesaw, baseball diamond, and tennis court. By one estimate, the cost of expanding and repairing the school exceeded $300,000, a considerable sum in those years, especially for an institution limited to some 40 children. 78 The renovation was completed in 1952, and the following spring, the Bettelheims themselves moved into more spacious lodgings. They had been living near the school in a railroad flat at 6103 Kentwood Avenue, to which they had moved from the small Dorchester Avenue apartment when they needed to make room for their second child, Naomi Michelle, who was born on November 19, 1945. When Eric Christopher, their last child, arrived on January 27, 1952, Bruno and Truth followed the path of millions of other American families in the post-war boom and went looking for a house. They found it across the midway from the school at 5725 Kentwood Avenue, the 3-story, detached, red brick home built in 1892 that they bought by scraping together $2,000 in cash and borrowing the rest of the $24,500 purchase price from a local bank and the university. We don't own it, rather the mortgage company owns us. But it is nice for the children, Bettelheim told James T. Farrell. 7 The dwelling, with a backyard in which Trude would indulge her love of gardening, sat in a neighborly, architecturally discordant line of wooden, brick, and stone houses and apartment buildings on a block graced with large trees and small front lawns. At the north end, the block gave into 57th Street, where Steenwatty's drug store, Woodworth and the Red Door bookstores, and a march of row houses bursting with students pulsed with campus life well into the evening. Except when the winter weather roared off the lake, turning the midway into a windswept steppe, the house was a pleasant 10-minute walk from the school. Bettelheim arrived there each morning around 9:30, as he had from the beginning, for a day crammed with administrative tasks, staff meetings, and interventions in crises large and small. Few details were too small for his personal attention. When the school had a chance to buy the $79 junior-size billiard table, he dispatched the memo to Ralph Tyler asking that he bring this need to the attention of the ECDC's Women's Auxiliary, which the chairman of the Department of Education promptly did. 8 degrees when Karen Carlson came to Bettelheim frantic because one of her children had the stomach flu and was getting sick. Bettelheim suggested she make the girl some Carlson. Where do my counselors come from that they've never heard of chamomile tea? Said the dismayed principal, who went and brewed the tea himself and spoon-fed it to the child. Most days, Bettelheim ate lunch at the staff table in the dining room, on his way in or out, sometimes placing a penny by a child's plate and asking for her thoughts. He went home for dinner, but was usually back at the school by 8 or 8:30, making rounds of the dorms, dropping in on the staff bull sessions, or disappearing into his office with a counselor to hear his or her problems. He spent many hours at the school on weekends. And early on Trude realized with some resentment that she had not married Bruno Bettelheim but the Sonia Shankman Orthogenic School. Gail Schulenberger recalled at least 2 occasions when Trude arrived at the school in tears, pleading with her husband to come home. He would put his arm around her and take her into the office, and a while later she would emerge, the flow staunched, and return to her motherly duties. Most nights, Bruno didn't arrive home until 1 or 2 in the morning, when the children, and then the counselors, finally drifted off to sleep, and the school was at last quiet. He would closet himself in his office and write.